Good morning. Good morning, everybody. My name is Kyle Zimmer, and I'm President, CEO, and co-founder of First Book. I'd like to welcome you all this morning and thank you for joining us as we present of our First Book Research and Insights study on educators' priorities for K through 12 funding through the American Rescue Plan. Let me give you a quick rundown of the next hour. I'm going to start with a brief overview of First Book, and then we will present our survey findings, and we'll save the last 15 minutes for questions. As you'll see, your microphone has been muted for today's webinar, but you can post questions at any time in the chat function, and we will address your questions during the Q&A portion. We are recording today's session, and we'll make it available on First Book's website through our American Rescue Plan resources page, which will also be, the link to which will be provided in the chat. In addition, we'll send a link to the recording by email to everyone who has registered. Now, let me give you a brief overview of our organization. First Book is a nonprofit social enterprise that furthers educational equity for children in need, ages 0 to 18, at under-resourced schools and programs all across the US. We believe so strongly in the power of education and the importance of being educator-driven that our entire organization is built on listening to and responding to educators on the front lines. These educators are the driving force for our models, for the resources we provide, and for the partnerships we create. As part of our mission, First Book does what no other organization does. We aggregate and elevate the collective voice of formal and informal educators serving children growing up in poverty. This includes teachers at Title I and Title I eligible schools, as well as those working at pre and after school programs, public libraries, museums, food pantries, health clinics, church basement programs, even barbershops and laundromats, anywhere that serves 70% or more children and families in need. These educators make up the First Book Network, which is a growing online community that now includes more than 500,000 of these powerful educators, with thousands joining every month. Joining the network is free. It takes about 5 minutes and provides enormous benefits, including access to free and affordable, diverse and inclusive books, a wide range of best-in-class educational resources, and the ability to drive the creation of the very resources needed to support both the educators and the children they serve. So let me put a plug in at this point. If you know of any educator or program in your community serving children in need, please encourage them to join our network and add their voice at www.firstbook.org. The voice of this online community guides everything we've built at First Book. To date, we have 3 main components of our work. The first is our research arm. It's called First Book Research and Insights, and we're going to be talking primarily about that today. First Book Research and Insights provides qualitative and quantitative data from our network of educators to inform academic studies, governmental policies, corporate product designs, and much more. Our research can be conducted nationally or segmented by geographic region, by educators serving certain age groups such as pre-K and early learning, by topic area, by educator function, such as school librarians or daycare providers, as well as a range of other segmentation strategies. This provides an unprecedented opportunity to learn about what is keeping educators up at night and what they see in their classrooms and programs, and what they need to remove barriers to learning for our most disadvantaged children. At present, we conduct about 30 studies every year. The second thing we've built is a nonprofit e-commerce site called the First Book Marketplace, which so far has provided over 200 million great books and resources for free or at very low cost to our members. These books celebrate diversity and use market strength to increase access by dramatically lowering the cost. In fact, the average cost of a book on our site runs about $3.80, and that includes shipping. The marketplace also carries basic needs items, school supplies, STEM kits, educational games, ebooks, and many other resources. Our third initiative is called the First Book Accelerator, which expedites evidence-based strategies from leading experts to address issues that have been identified by our educators, such as social and emotional learning, cultural diversity, grief and loss, and trauma. First Book works with recognized experts to create actionable resources, such as free downloadable toolkits, videos, webinars, and many other resources. As a result, our educators gain access to these expert strategies to support their students in months, not decades. So that's a little about First Book, but we're here today to elevate the voice of educators serving children in need and their priorities for the American Rescue Plan funds. As you know, because of the unprecedented impact of COVID-19 on our nation's education system, the federal government has designated $123 billion to support K-12 education and related programs. States have been required to develop and submit plans detailing how they're going to allocate the funds. And those funds can be spent through September 30th, 2024. In addition, states and districts must comply with new equity requirements, which prevent state and local funding cuts from disproportionately impacting high poverty districts and schools. Given this significant one-time investment, we felt that it was critical to understand and to elevate input from educators in the First Book Network to make sure those educators who directly serve children in need were given the opportunity to weigh in on how funds could best support learning for the children they serve. Now, I'd like to introduce Jules Appleton, First Book's Director of Research and Insights, to present the survey findings from our educators. Jules?
Thanks, Kyle. Hi, everyone. Welcome, and thank you so much for joining us this morning. So we're about to dive into the results from our American Rescue Plan survey. And as Kyle mentioned, the American Rescue Plan Act is the government's single largest investment into education to date. And the goal of this survey was to uncover educators' insights into how they think this funding should be distributed, what resources or opportunities they would want to tap into using this funding, and how First Book might be able to support in some of these areas, whether that's helping educators get resources themselves or helping lift up their needs to education administrators and leaders. So here's a quick overview of the topics we'll be discussing today. We'll start by reviewing our research methodology and a summary of our top level findings. Then we'll cover how educators would prioritize American Rescue Plan funding to best serve the communities that they work in. And then we'll take a deeper look into how educators would personally prioritize this funding to benefit their own classrooms. Then we'll close out by addressing the need to elevate educators' voices in this space, including some direct open-ended feedback from respondents, which will really illustrate the needs of educators in the field right now. So with that, let's take a quick look at our research methodology and respondent demographics for the survey, just to set the scene for you. So the survey went out to nearly 400,000 educators within the First Book Network. And as Kyle mentioned, registered members of the First Book Network all work in Title I or Title I eligible schools or work for programs or organizations in which at least 70% of the children they serve come from low-income families. So this means that when I use the term educator throughout this discussion, I'm not just referring to a standard classroom teacher. We use the term educator to broadly refer to any practitioner who serves children in need. So you'll see a little bit on the next slide, a bit more about who those educators are. We received 2004 completed responses to this survey, and it's that respondent set of 2004 educators serving children from low-income families that we'll be looking at today. Here's a snapshot of the kinds of educators who completed this survey. So you'll see that we've got the most representation among school-based programs, which make up 76% of our respondents. But we also heard from early childhood programs and nonprofits and libraries and so on. And then over here to the right, you'll see 55% of respondents were teachers, 16% were librarians, 9% were program administrators, and so on. We had the largest representation among those serving elementary school ages in this survey. Those working in larger school districts with over 10,000 students were also heavily represented, and we had heavy representation in urban areas. However, we still have significant representation of all ages served, all school district sizes, and all geographic areas. And then lastly, at the bottom, you'll see that 75% of respondents to this survey have worked in education for over a decade. So some really seasoned educators here. And this is our spread by state. So you'll see we have representation from all 50 states plus DC and Puerto Rico in this survey. Now, let's quickly review the top level findings from this study before we dive into the data. And I like to review the top findings first so that you can keep these themes in mind as we move through the detailed results of this survey. Knowing the main findings up front just helps you get a feel for how the data informs our larger story here as we walk through it. So from this survey, we will learn that books remain a simple and almost unanimous need among educators after this pandemic year. We'll hear that additional staff are necessary to fully support students and educator success. We'll talk about the continuing digital divide that disproportionately affects children in need and must be addressed to ensure the success of all students across the country. We'll get a glimpse into the need for schools to have deeper community partnerships that can help address mental health concerns and food insecurity for children and families. We'll touch on the high demand for trauma response preparedness among educators, how whole child support is critical right now, meaning we must address student mental and emotional well-being as well as meet their basic needs in order to make a child able to thrive. And lastly, we'll see a call from respondents asking to be properly valued as educators, meaning we must support their mental and emotional well-being after this unprecedented teaching year and that they need support in the classroom, adequate resources, and simply to be trusted. So these are the major trends that you'll see as we walk through this data. And now it's time to dig into the actual results. So we'll start with educators' feedback on the needs of their communities and schools at a high level and how American Rescue Plan funding can be used to support these big picture needs. We wanted to start by asking educators, how much of your own personal money have you spent in the last year to support your classroom or program? And what do you typically spend that money on? And what we learned is that only 2% of educators spent $0 of their own money last year. That means 98% spent at least some amount of their own personal money to support students last year. On top of that, 59% spent between $100 and $500, and 13% spent over $1,000. So this data aligns with our research that we've done in the past in terms of educator spending. So we actually just closed out another First Book study very recently that revealed in a typical year, educators are spending an average of $346 out of their own pockets on books and learning materials for their classrooms and programs. So that study isn't published yet. You can keep an eye out for more information on that, but this $100 to $500 range is standard out-of-pocket teacher pay among the educators that we serve who work in low-income communities. So we know educators are spending a significant amount of money out of pocket to support their students, but what are they spending that money on? Well, books mostly. So looking at this chart on the right, you can see that 91% of respondents to this survey said they spend their own money on books for their kids. We also had 73% who purchased classroom supplies, and then we've got games and activities, snacks and meals, and you can see how the rest of these items fall into place here. Before we leave this slide, I want to draw your attention to the crosstab findings quickly. So cross-tabulation is a method of analysis that allows you to analyze the relationship between multiple variables within a data set. And in our case, this means we are looking at how respondents of different job titles answered this specific question to see if we can identify any differences between how teachers spend their money versus librarians, or in this case, principals. So what we learned from this crosstab analysis is that while educators who work directly with kids, such as teachers and librarians, are most often using their own money to purchase books, principals and vice principals are more often using their own money to purchase food and other basic needs items for students. So we saw that 79% of principals taking the survey reported that they currently spend their personal money to purchase basic needs items for students versus only 43% of the general population of respondents. And 75% of our principals purchase snacks and meals with their money versus only 50% of general respondents. So really, while we know that educators spend their own money to help meet students' basic needs all the time, there is a slightly higher rate of principals and vice principals who seem to be spending their money on these items versus other job titles. So we've got an idea of how much money educators spent last year out of pocket and what they generally spend their money on. Now we want to get to one of our major questions with this survey. How should this American Rescue Plan funding be spent? What would educators do with a large influx of funding for their schools and communities? We wanted to ask this question in two ways. First, from a big picture standpoint. So based on what you as an educator know the needs of your school or community to be, where do you think this funding should go? And then later, if you personally had access to some of this funding, what would you do with it to further your personal work in your classroom or program? So we'll tackle each of these questions separately, but let's start with the big picture here. We provided our respondents with a brief overview of what the ARP Act is and posed the first question. Think about the challenges faced by children and families in your community. Which of the following areas would benefit most from a financial investment aimed at supporting learning, recovery, and enrichment among the kids you serve? And then we asked our respondents to rank 10 predefined areas of need. So this list was created based on First Book's most recent research in combination with anecdotal feedback from educators we work with. So this list is grounded in previous research and displays what we already know the top areas of need to be among the educators we serve. So over here on the right, you'll see the definitive ranking of these items in order of which items respondents think are in need of American Rescue Plan funding the most. So you'll see that books and learning materials for students came in as the #1 area in need of funding. Then we've got resources to support student mental health and well-being. Coming in third is additional staff, and we've got improved Wi-Fi and so on. So here we have a quote directly from an educator speaking to the need for additional staff. This came in as the #3 area most in need of funding in that previous question. So now there are a few direct educator quotes sprinkled throughout this deck, and I am actually going to take the time to read them with you, simply because qualitative feedback like this from educators is so central to the research work that First Book does. Educators' stories and firsthand accounts are what gives color and meaning to our data and gives us the full picture of what the numbers are telling us. So this educator says, we need more staff. So many teachers and assistants have left or are leaving the profession due to how we are undersupported, given increased responsibilities and poor pay. We mentally are suffering, covering all the additional duties, and our scholars are not being supported as well as they should be. Now, let's examine the breakdown of this ranking. So we're still dealing with the same question and the same set of responses as that previous question. But this chart shows the percent of respondents who ranked each item listed in that previous list in their top 5 areas of need. So how you read this chart would be a total of 86% of respondents ranked books and learning materials in their top 5 areas in need of funding, with 31% ranking it as their number 1 area in need of funding, represented by the dark blue bar there, and 19% ranking it as their number 2 area in need of funding, represented by the light blue bar. And then next, you'll see that 79% of respondents ranked student mental health resources in their top 5, and so on. So looking at this breakdown shows us just how much books and learning materials and student mental health support really outweigh all other areas of need, which speaks to 2 of our top findings, the need for books and the need for whole child support. So you can already start to see a few of our main findings emerge here. And here's a quote from an educator that illustrates these 2 main findings for us: the need for both books and learning materials and the need for student mental health support. And this educator quote actually also touches on 2 other main findings: the need for additional staff and the importance of valuing and supporting teachers. So this educator says, students, families, and teachers need to be supported with materials to send home to students, especially a variety of books so that students have books in their hands. Teachers lost so much of their materials and books over the last 2 years trying to support students. Teachers need supplies replenished, libraries replenished, and additional school employees need to be hired to meet the demands of how far behind students are at this time. Social emotional resources need to be available to teachers and students and their families. It needs to be free. It needs to be something that is available with no strings attached. Too many times, teachers are not able to help themselves because they know it will affect their students. So next, we wanted to follow up with everyone that prioritized community partnerships in the previous question to dig a little deeper there and see what they need from community partnerships. So respondents who ranked the item greater community partnerships in their top 7 areas of need in the previous question were then asked, which of these issues could additional community partnerships help address for the children and families you serve? And what we learn is that the most pressing community needs revolve around child and family mental health, enrichment opportunities for students, and food insecurity. So you can see that 81% of educators believe community partnerships could help address child and family mental health. 78% believe they could help support enrichment opportunities. Then we've got 74% who believe community partnerships could help address food insecurity, and so on down the list. So the results from this question just continue to drive home the need for whole child support right now. Educators are looking to the community for help in supporting students' mental health and basic needs to really provide an all-encompassing support system for students so that they can thrive. One educator puts it so well with this quote, saying, parents in our struggling neighborhoods need community wraparound supports, that's mental and physical health, parks and recreation, schools and centers, to function efficiently and thrive. We can flood them with all the materials from school to cram the homes, cars, trailers, and or tents that they live in. But if families are struggling to manage their physical living environments during a pandemic, then they will not be successful in utilizing the abundance of materials in their environments. Our leaders need to understand that its citizens require not stuff, but effective and well-funded spaces outside of school and home to support the varied needs of children. So we covered the big picture view of how educators think American Rescue Plan funding should be used to best support their communities and schools. But what about how they personally would use funding from this initiative? It's one of our favorite research questions at First Book, asking our members to be selfish. What do you personally need to support your work? So let's dive into our classroom and program needs and how American Rescue Plan funding can support educators' individual work. We started with the question, if you had purchasing power for items to support your individual classroom or program or the kids you serve, how would you prioritize the following items? We then offered them a list of items, which again, were based off of our previous research into what educators' classroom and program needs most commonly are. And then we offered them a priority scale to rate each item. And the scale we offered was simple. An item could either be labeled a top priority purchase, a priority but not a top priority, or not a priority purchase. And what we learn is that when it comes to personal prioritization, educators agree that books are a top priority purchase. So the dark blue bars here represent the percent of respondents who marked an item as a top priority purchase, and the light blue bars are a secondary priority, and the red bars are representing not a priority. So you can see that 77% of our respondents categorize books as a top priority purchase, and 22% consider books to be a priority, but not a top priority, and so on. That's how you read this chart. So this chart can be a bit overwhelming. So if you take a look at the blue box to the bottom left here, this calls out the combined data for items that were selected as a top priority purchase or a priority, but not a top priority. So combining these two scale points allows us to look at the larger view of what items educators would personally prioritize if they had funding available, whether it's a top or a secondary priority. And when you look at the top and secondary priorities combined, we learn that 99% of educators would personally prioritize purchasing books with this funding. 87% would prioritize purchasing classroom cleaning and art supplies with this funding. And then we've got snacks and adaptive learning materials and remote learning support that all pop up as top priority needs here. So this question was actually the basis for a series of follow-up questions. So for each item that a respondent prioritized in this question, either as a top or a secondary priority, we asked a follow-up question about what specific items they need in this space. So now we're going to dig a little deeper into two of the themes from this list: books and digital learning resources. So we'll start with the need for books. All respondents who prioritized books in that previous question, meaning all but 1% of respondents, since 99% prioritized books in some way, we asked, what kinds of books do you want and how will you use them? Looking at this chart on the left, what we learn is that educators are largely looking for books that encourage reading for pleasure, engage struggling readers, reflect diversity and inclusion, and promote social and emotional learning. And how do educators plan to use these books? So the chart on the right tells us that they want to send books home with kids and also use books to enhance their curriculum. And we also have 72% of educators who want to use books to encourage empathetic and inclusive environments. So there's a clear theme here of educators wanting to use books to encourage a love of reading and promote diversity and inclusion and encourage the emotional well-being of students. And these results are consistent with all our research when it comes to how educators use their books. We see these themes emerge often throughout our work. And you may also be thinking to yourself on this slide, well, First Book is all about books, so isn't it safe to assume that your network of members are more likely to be book enthusiasts than the general population of educators? And that's a totally fair question. With all our research, we take this assumption into account, and we take every measure to reduce response bias. And this includes randomizing answer options for all respondents so that books are never at the top of a list when answering questions. It includes careful and consistent questioning and phrasing to continually remind respondents to think beyond books when completing a survey with us. Here we have another educator quote that really exemplifies the importance of books, as well as touching on another main finding, again, the need for whole child support, so really drilling that theme home. This educator says, many of my students do not have books of their own. Some of past students have told me that they have shared the gifted book with younger siblings. It is important for our students to feel that they are important. And when teachers give them access to items that their families cannot afford, it makes a difference on students' emotional self. So now let's take a look at educators' need for digital learning resources more closely. We had 76% of respondents who prioritized digital learning resources in the previous question. So we asked those respondents to tell us a bit more about the digital learning resources that they need. And we learned that most are looking for apps and internet or hotspots, online learning tools, and iPads. Now, we did learn something from running a crosstab analysis on this question, which isn't shown on the slide, but I'm going to summarize quickly for you guys because I think it's interesting. We learned that when looking at these results by job title, we saw that the responsibility of purchasing digital resources for students seems to be shifting. So about half of teachers report spending their personal money on digital resources in the past, while only a third of principals reported the same. However, principals are now more likely to prioritize incoming ARP funding to support closing the digital divide compared to other groups. So we saw that approximately 84% of principals would now prioritize this funding to go to digital learning resources compared to only 76% of the general population. So what this tells us is that it appears that while classroom teachers used to be the group likely to purchase digital materials for their students, we're now seeing principals and vice principals prioritize it as an item that needs to be funded, most likely due to the recent unforeseen switch to remote learning for everyone. The importance of addressing the digital divide is just clearly becoming a top priority for those working with students in need, illustrating again another one of our main findings. This educator talks about the digital divide, saying the pandemic has shown in a real-time way how inequities in access to technology and internet can impact students. Now, let's switch gears and talk a bit about another one of our main findings, the need for trauma response preparedness. Now, to give you all an idea of how prevalent childhood trauma is right now, according to the CDC, in 2020, there has been a 24% spike nationwide in mental health related emergency room visits among children between the ages of 5 and 11, and a 31% rise among those between the ages of 12 and 17. So this is all since the pandemic hit, essentially. So all respondents were asked, how prepared do you feel to support children who experienced trauma, grief, and loss over the last year? And the results? We see that only 14% of educators feel very or extremely prepared to support children who have experienced trauma over the last year. So then we followed up with a question about what resources would help to better equip educators to meet the needs of children experiencing trauma right now. You can see here that books and conversation guides would be the most helpful resources for educators looking to support children who've experienced trauma or loss, along with additional trained staff and additional community partnerships as close runner-ups. Now, this does not mean that educators think books and conversation guides are enough alone to help children who are experiencing trauma, grief, or loss. But we often see in our research that educators are looking for whatever materials they can get their hands on that help them navigate these difficult situations in the classroom as they work. So many schools in low-income communities do not have school psychologists or even guidance counselors a lot of the time. So many educators want to do whatever they can to support struggling children in lieu of being able to send them to a professional mental health counselor. Here we have an educator speaking to the need for trauma support, saying, please invest money in trauma training for educators. When we came back in person, we saw many students who had gone without food, books, and who had been abused. Teach us how to handle these situations and recognize when there may be a serious issue. So we're coming to the end here, believe it or not. So lastly, we'll cover the need to elevate educators' voices in this space. We wanted to know where educators stand in terms of weighing in on how American Rescue Plan funding will be spent. We wanted to ask two questions. One, as an educator or leader working to support children in need, how important do you believe it is to provide your input into how American Rescue Plan funds can best be used? And two, have you had the opportunity to provide input? And what we learn is 97% of educators believe it is extremely or very important that their opinions be considered when determining where American Rescue Plan funding is directed. Meanwhile, only 17% have had the chance to contribute to the funding conversation so far. So in the chart to the left, our dark blue and light blue segments represent respondents who report that it's extremely and very important that they provide input respectively. And to the right, we have the two light red and dark red pieces of this pie chart that indicate respondents who answered, I was able to contribute my insights in detail, selected by only 9% of respondents, and I had the opportunity to contribute, but only at a high level, selected by 8% of respondents. So lastly, we asked respondents a single open-ended question about funding priorities to give them the space to address their most pressing needs and bring up anything else that wasn't mentioned in this survey that they may want leaders to keep in mind as this American Rescue Plan funding is distributed. So we asked, what else should your district superintendent or education leaders know about what you need to promote equity for all children in your community? And respondents were allowed to write in any answer they wanted in this space. And so here you can see some of the most common themes among these free write-in responses. Not surprisingly, most of the feedback to this question reflected what the data proved our main findings to be already. But a few themes that were outside our main findings did bubble up, and those include invest in libraries and learning spaces, support children with special needs, and allow for slow and steady reintegration into classrooms, and support out-of-school learning experiences are just among the few that are outside of our main findings, but still really relevant. And then you can also see our main findings sprinkled in here because they were all reiterated by educators in answering the final question. So ensure access to necessary technologies to close the digital divide, hire high-quality staff, support students' mental and emotional health, support educators in the classroom, as well as support their overall well-being, and collaborate with local community organizations to support all aspects of a child's well-being. And here's our last quote from an educator who is making a plea for educators to be heard and their voices, thoughts, and ideas to be valued. This educator says, please, please, please ask classroom teachers what resources they need. Do not assume that we all need the same type of support. Do not take our constructive criticism as negativity. Listen and find ways to support us, even when it seems that we are able to handle everything on our own. There is a huge difference between schools, even within the same state or within the same district. There is a school 10 miles from the one where I teach, where all students have access to electives like art, band, chorus, technology, STEM lab. We have none of those. The quality of school and its resources should not depend on its zip code or the principal's last name. So that's it for the data that we're going to cover today. But before we open it up for questions, I want to mention that in addition to conducting this survey, First Book has developed a special resource section on our website that is dedicated to helping states, school districts, and decision makers maximize their American Rescue Plan funding. So this section, which you can access via the first link listed here, features highlights from the American Rescue Plan Educator Survey. It identifies specific ways to provide more resources to more children using ARP funding, and it helps schools connect with First Book resources. In addition, there is a downloadable fact sheet for each state, which provides information on how First Book members and resources are distributed locally. And again, you'll be able to access a recording of this webinar, and you can also reach all this information through First Book's website at www.firstbook.org. So now I believe we're going to open things up for questions, and we'll start with some of the questions in the chat function, which I believe my colleague Candice has been collecting for us.
Hi, thanks, Jules. That was great. It's always so inspiring to hear what our network has to say and to be able to share it among others who care so much about kids in need. Wondering if Kyle can maybe say a little bit more about how we work with other organizations through research and insights. That's a curiosity folks are wondering about at this time.
Sure, I'm happy to. The thrilling part about our design, about First Book over almost 30 years, is that we work with other organizations. That's what we're all about. And so we constantly are reaching out through our national partners as well as through our network, where we talk to the American Federation of Teachers, we talk to Head Start, we talk to all of our major partners, and to begin to gather what they believe topics of interest would be. We obviously, we're watching the the press to see what major current issues might be also having a splash effect on our network members. We really reach out. None of this is done in isolation. We really reach out through every single channel to make sure that it informs everything we're thinking about.
Thanks, Kyle. Some other folks were asking about how to sign up with First Book, and now that we have this slide up, it's a great reminder. Just go right to firstbook.org/register and sign up for free. Spread the word with your networks as well. And of course, if you want to be in touch about partnerships at large scale, you can email at partnerships@firstbook.org.
Great. So if there are no more questions, then I believe we might have some closing remarks from Kyle again. Are there any more questions, Candace, or is that it for us?
We've got one more that just came in. Does First Book work with the American Library Association and American Association of School Libraries? Absolutely. We have a number of members of those associations in the First Book network, and are always looking to deepen our relationships with associations themselves. So if there's opportunities that we can connect on more deeply, please don't hesitate to be in touch via the email that was provided there. And we'd love to talk about how we might do even more together.
Okay, so is that, are those all the questions?
I think that's all the questions. Thanks, Candace, for gathering those. Thank you, everybody, for listening to my overview of the data. And Kyle, if you want to say some closing remarks, then I believe we can wrap up a little early.
Sure. So, it's clear to all of us that there are deep ramifications resulting from the disruption in learning, and that the even more pronounced gap in access to educational resources and opportunities, it's just getting wider as a result of the pandemic. McKinsey has estimated that the pandemic could limit this generation's prospects and opportunities far into adulthood. The cost is not only to the individual children, but also to our workforce, our economy, and our society at large. McKinsey estimates that unless sufficient steps are taken to address the pandemic's impact on learning, today's students will experience real impact on their earnings over their entire lifetime. The impact on the US economy could amount to between $128 billion to $188 billion every single year as this cohort enters the workforce. First Book believes that an essential part of the solution is to support our nation's educators, to listen to and act on their insights. To further learning recovery, we need to take action now to infuse our classrooms and programs with high-quality educational resources, including the mental health supports and in high poverty communities that Jules referred to when she was presenting the data. We're so grateful for your time and your participation today. Please see the contact information on this slide. And if you have additional questions or ideas, or if you'd like to partner with us to bring more resources to educators and children in your state, in your district, or across the country, please join us, please advise us, and help us build this together. Thank you so much.
Thank you all.